All right, so as Jennifer said, my name is Simone Chriss. I'm a civil rights attorney, and I am the director of the Transgender Rights Initiative here at Southern Legal Counsel. I do a lot of impact litigation against the state, challenging discriminatory laws and policies, as well as lots of individual advocacy on behalf of trans folks and LGBTQ folks in schools and employment and accessing healthcare and name and gender marker changes, back when gender marker changes were allowed. Et cetera. And so I'm happy to be with you all tonight. I just want to say, from the start, if you're here and you're feeling overwhelmed, it's by design. If you are feeling like you can't possibly keep up, that is by design. They are following a playbook that, unfortunately, here in the state of Florida, we are all too familiar with. I keep saying this, but Project 2025 is Florida 2023. And while that is not comforting, it has been grueling to be on the ground in the state of Florida for the past few years. It means that we have lived this. Most of what I'm going to talk to you about today, we've already lived. We've already figured out how to resist and how to challenge and how to fight back and how to survive, honestly. But just remember that the information overload, the just constant onslaught of new horrific things coming from the federal government, it is intended to wear us down, to break us down, to make it impossible to accurately and thoroughly analyze any particular policy or executive order or what have you, because there's just too much. And so by being here, this is an act of resistance. By not succumbing to apathy and hopelessness and stopping even trying to keep up with it, this is an act of resistance. So thank you all for being here and keep doing what you're doing. All right, we're going to dive in. I'm just going to very quickly go through this. Almost all of this introductory stuff I have put out in statements that you can find on our website, southernlegal.org. But I just want to remind folks that executive orders are not law. President Trump might think that he can do what Congress does and do what the judiciary does through executive orders, but that's not something that he can do. And federal courts, I'm going to go through the challenges to these orders, but federal courts have made clear that it is beyond the scope of his powers, right? What can executive orders do? They are directives telling federal agencies what the president wants to see done. They are largely political messaging, right? It is messaging to the base of, look, I'm attacking trans people the way that I said I would. I'm hurting immigrants the way that I said I would, et cetera. It does not have the weight of law, and they are rarely self-implementing or executing. They require these federal agencies to take actions to implement the orders. And super importantly, they have to be grounded in existing law and constitutional authority, and they are subject to judicial review. So courts can block them, and we've seen that happening with a lot of success thus far. They are intended to sow fear and confusion among those that are targeted and impacted, and they have been very successful in doing so. But what I think is that when we understand what they mean and what they don't mean, and we understand our rights, it takes so much of the power away, because the goal is to scare us into doing or not doing what they want us to do or not do, right? We saw in Florida that before the Board of Medicine rules or SB 254 even went into effect, how many providers stopped providing gender affirming care to minors out of fear of what could happen, not what the law actually said, not anything that was enforceable. How many people stopped using bathrooms when the trans bathroom bill went into effect, despite the fact that the enforcement mechanism in that state law is ridiculous and we've seen no enforcement of it, no arrests whatsoever. The point is, it is intended to make us afraid to exercise our rights and afraid to do the things that they don't want us to do. So we take their power away when we understand them. All right, so there's been a number of anti-trans executive orders that we're going to go through. But the first, the Defending Women, I'm not going to read the titles because I just find them so offensive. So I'm just going to tell you what I call them. This is the Seeking to Legally Erase Trans People bill. Then we saw the Seeking to Exclude Trans People from the Military order. Then the Trying to Ban Gender Affirming Care order. And then the Punishing Schools and Teachers that Support Trans Students order, and then the Trans Sports Ban order, and the the hateful the hateful rhetoric in these is I don't know if folks so often I tell someone, oh, did you see that it says blank? And I'll read an actual provision from the order. And they're like, no, it doesn't really say that, because they're seeing the headlines about, big picture things about these executive orders. But when you actually read them, the language is so horrifying that they seem like maybe not real, like publicity put out to make this administration look bad. But I recommend everyone read the full executive orders. Okay, so what do they actually do? What do they mean? And how can they be enforced? First is the erasing the legal recognition of trans people executive order. So basically, it declares it is the policy of the United States to deny the existence of trans, non-binary, and intersex Americans. No, it does not use that exact language. It's worse than that, but that's the basis of what it does, because it says there are only two sexes, and it redefines sex and male and female and all of these terms in ways that are so divorced from reality, science, evidence, and outside of the consensus in our country that it's wild. It tells the executive branches to rely on those discriminatory definitions when interpreting and applying federal laws. This does not change the laws, though. You can't just say Title VII means only protects based on sex assigned at birth or biological sex and make it law, because there is binding Supreme Court precedent that says otherwise. There is guidance and regulations and the common sense understanding of sex in 2025 that all says otherwise. It prohibits gender marker changes on passports and X gender markers on passports, which previously were permitted. It bans gender marker changes on Social Security, visas, etc. So it requires that these documents reflect a person's sex assigned at birth. I'm going to go into more detail and answer questions that I'm sure you all have about passports and Social Security in a little bit. But just noting that the White House has publicly made clear that this is prospective, not retrospective. They are not going to be rescinding or invalidating existing passports that a person had in hand prior to January 20th when this was issued. However, when something is changed or the passport is renewed, they will revert it back to your sex assigned at birth. So I'm gonna get into that. So if you have questions on that, hold them for me until we get to that section. But know that name changes are still permitted on all government issued identification documents, state and federal. It prohibits housing transgender women in women's prisons or detention centers, and prohibits the use of federal funding for gender affirming care for folks who are incarcerated. And then it requires removal of the affirming HUD rule that protected trans individuals in need of housing and homelessness services. Okay, and then it directs agencies to rescind certain guidance. And this is important. I didn't include this I don't know if folks attended the town hall I did recently on this. I'm doing another one on the 13th if you're interested. I'm including this for this group particularly because so many of the documents that we as advocates for LGBTQ youth in schools and parents of LGBTQ youth relied upon were not necessarily, black letter law, because things have evolved so much over time, but rather these really amazing guidance documents that were put out under first the Obama administration and then under the Biden administration that just made clear things that we knew to be true, such as sex includes LGBTQ students, right? So by rescinding all of these pieces of guidance, they aren't changing the law in any way. Let's just be super clear. They are not changing what Title IX, how it can be enforced and what it should be doing. They're not changing the Constitution. They're not changing FERPA or any of these laws that protect LGBTQ kids, but they rescind the guidance that tells schools very clearly how to apply them in a way that protects LGBTQ students. So all of these things were rescinded. And again, doesn't change the law, but it's messaging, right? So then we saw, that was the rescissions of harmful executive orders and actions. And so some of those include preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation. It's hard to not like, I don't understand how they don't see themselves as the bad guys when they're like, day one, let's take away this thing called advancing equality for LGBTQ individuals. You're like, that was controversial. That was problematic for you. Guaranteeing an educational environment free from discrimination. No way, Jose, not here. Anyway, the language is ridiculous. Okay, so the next executive order we saw that was anti-trans was the military ban. And you might be thinking, didn't they already do this? They did. They wasted a whole bunch of taxpayer money and a whole bunch of time already litigating the same issue the first time around, but here we are again. So it uses really, really derogatory language to talk about how being transgender is literally inconsistent with the principles of being in the military. It adopts the same inaccurate definitions from that first one that I mentioned. It instructs the implementation of this policy to end invented and identification-based pronoun usage. It prohibits military members from having shared sleeping, changing, or bathing facilities that are aligned with their gender identity, etc. And then there was an update on February 26th with additional guidance, basically just saying, making it just worse, saying like, if you have a current or history of gender dysphoria, you should be removed from military service, blah, blah, blah. It just keeps getting worse. Okay, next one. This is one of the most, the ones I've gotten the most questions about and the most fear about, which is the trying to ban gender affirming care for minors. Leading up to this, so folks might know that I was part of the litigation team that challenged our version of the gender affirming care ban for minors, SB 254, and the Board of Medicine rules that made it a felony for doctors to prescribe this care, and implemented the first ever restrictions on adults accessing this care in the country. And I got a lot of questions about, are they going to do a federal ban? Are they going to do a federal ban on gender affirming care? And I kept saying, they can't ban the provision of care federally, right? Each state's Board of Medicine governs what the doctors in that state can do, how medicine can be prescribed and practiced, right? What they can do is control the purse strings. They can control federal funding. And so while this executive order looks like a ban on gender affirming care for minors, what it is a threat of withholding federal funding from institutions that provide this care. So alarmingly, super alarmingly, they define the word child to include people who are 18. So they define child as anyone under 19. And y'all, that was not a typo. It was not an oversight. It was battle testing, seeing what are we going to do when they include just a little bit of the population of adults to see how far they can take this. And we need to be real loud and real clear that we are not on board with this. I mean, we shouldn't be on board with banning care for minors at all either, but including 18-year-olds is just testing the waters, right? So it bans the federal government from funding, sponsoring, promoting, assisting, or supporting gender affirming care for minors, which includes Medicaid, Medicare, TRICARE, federal health benefits, and federal research grants. It redefines gender affirming care with really disgusting, inflammatory, inaccurate language. It directs federal agencies to stop relying on the well-established evidence-based standards of care that are developed by experts over decades, WPATH, Endocrine Society guidelines. It requires the Department of Health and Human Services to publish a literature review. You guys were here when this happened in Florida, when Governor DeSantis and Surgeon General Ladapo asked the Agency for Healthcare Administration to do a GAPAMS report to evaluate whether gender affirming care was experimental. And that led to the ban of all the bans on care that we've seen in this state. This is also like the CAS review in the UK that sort of served as the justification for rolling back access to care there. It's not good. It's not good news. Mostly because these folks have a predetermined outcome and they are unconcerned with what the facts and evidence actually say. Okay, and then here's the kicker. It directs federal agencies to make sure that medical schools and hospitals that receive federal research and education grants don't provide gender affirming care to minors. So this is coercing medical providers who are just doing their job and providing evidence-based medicine that is required for their patients, their transgender patients, to thrive and be healthy. It is threatening to withhold future federal funding if they continue doing so. In a very thinly veiled attempt to weaponize a totally unrelated provision of the law, a provision of law, it talks about female genital mutilation. And this is just a disgusting attempt to trick people into thinking that it could possibly be a crime to provide gender-affirming care. But if you actually read the section of the law that they cite in the US Code, they define female genital mutilation as a procedure or operation performed for non-medical reasons that involves partial or total removal of female genitalia. If you ever heard of puberty blockers, are familiar with what they do, with hormones, with literally anything other than bottom surgery on a trans male, which even that would not be defined as this, but that's the only thing that even could reasonably be swept into the gambit of what this law prohibits. This is a scare tactic. So there is nothing in here that makes gender affirming care a crime to prescribe. Don't worry. In Florida, we did that. That's different. But this executive order does not do that. It seeks to weaponize DOJ against sanctuary states that provide protections for trans youth. But again, these things are not immediate. So the heads of the federal agencies that are required for implementing this have to first create a plan for implementation. They have to do an assessment of all the hospitals and medical schools in the country, which is a lot of them, that receive federal research and education grants, decide whether they're doing this, providing this type of care, then try to get them to stop or withhold future federal funding. I just have to say it is abhorrent to me and blows my mind that there are institutions and hospitals that are in blue states up north that within 24 hours of this executive order, were removing their gender affirming care programs, taking them off the website, putting out publicly that they're not doing this care anymore. When the doctors that I work with, that I have the honor of working with in the state of Florida that are still providing this care, have been doing so since May 17th, 2023, under threat of felony prosecution, right? Threat of losing their jobs, their careers, and their freedoms. And seeing these people in these institutions stop providing care to minors under the threat of potential hypothetical future federal funding being withheld, give me a break. Sorry. Okay. So, supporting what I just said about the ridiculousness of that provision, about basically saying like the attorney generals are going to arrest doctors under this Female Genital Mutilation Act and arrest parents who get their children this care. This group of attorney generals made clear that there is absolutely no connection between, it's 15 attorney generals from 15 different states that put out this statement saying there's no connection between female genital mutilation and gender affirming care, and there's no federal law that makes gender affirming care unlawful. Boom. Okay. Next, and this is just an overview of the executive orders. Then we're going to talk about where they are legally and the challenges to them, et cetera. So this one is probably the most relevant for many folks on here who are seeking to support their LGBTQ, particularly trans youth in schools. This is the basically don't say LGBTQ at the federal level. Seeking to punish schools and teachers for supporting trans students, to whitewash our history, and to mandate patriotism. So what this does is it again adopts those same unscientific sex-related definitions from that first order I talked about. It prohibits teachers in schools and teachers from supporting trans students. That's what it does, right? But it says you can't support the social transition of a student, which they define to include using the student's affirmed name and pronouns, calling a child non-binary, using facilities aligned with the student's gender identity, and more, seeing a school counselor, et cetera. What I think is super important, and we're going to look at this language together in a second, is you have to read this in conjunction with, at the same time as, the purposes of the executive order, which are all about parental rights, right? So I have questions I'm getting questions from teachers and guidance counselors and parents all over asking, does this mean they can't use my kid's affirmed name and pronouns if I'm telling the school like, I want you to use my kid's affirmed name and pronouns. If that kid, let's say, has legally transitioned and their birth certificate says the correct name and pronouns, you're saying that these teachers have to use, because remember, it adopted those definitions, meaning regardless of legal transition, regardless of anything else, you have to use the person's sex assigned at birth, which they define, again, totally inaccurately. But when you read it in conjunction with the purpose, which is to end the usurping of parental authority and to protect parents' rights from their kids being indoctrinated, etc., it's super unclear how this will be enforced. And again, that is by design. They want people to err on the side of caution. But we're going to look at that language in a minute. It requires the development within 90 days of an ending indoctrination strategy to eliminate federal funding for schools that support and protect trans youth or acknowledge the existence of concepts like gender identity, racism, white privilege, and unconscious bias, which they say are imprinting anti-American, subversive, harmful, and false ideologies on our nation's children. It weaponizes attorney generals. So most of what I'm talking about tonight, the only enforcement mechanism is threat of losing federal funding. And we're going to talk about how many courts have already said that executive orders cannot take away federal funding, that Congress has to do that, right? Nevertheless, there's one provision in here that is not about federal funding, and it weaponizes attorney general and state's attorneys to file appropriate actions against K through 12 teachers and school officials who violate the law, which again includes using a transgender student's affirmed name and pronouns. And then it directs this, if y'all, this is not relevant to like LGBTQ stuff, but I just implore all of you to read this provision of this executive order because it is so unhinged. It's called Reestablishing the President's Advisory 1776 Commission and Promoting Patriotic Education. It is the definition of indoctrination. So the title of this executive order is just profoundly ironic to me. It's horrifying. Okay. So in a nutshell, the things it uses federal funding to accomplish are these 5 things, right? Making students use their sex assigned at birth and given name at birth, trying to force no access to bathrooms not aligned with sex assigned at birth, punishing schools that allow kids to play sports in accordance with their gender identity, punishing schools that deliberately conceal a child's gender identity from their parents, and then punishing schools that teach topics related to gender identity. And guess what, y'all? Florida's already done all of this. So one sort of reassuring thing is all of you can tell your kid's school district whatever actions you took, whatever changes you made to bring your stuff into compliance, your policies into compliance with Don't Say Gay #1, the HB 1557, and then Don't Say LGBTQ #2, the pronoun ban and all the expansion to 12th grade, etc., with HB 1069, you've already done it. If you're in compliance with Florida's law, you're good. You're probably, going too far, in fact. And so that I hope is a little bit reassuring because like our school districts have already navigated this situation. But again, I just want to remind parents, like, this is all about parents' rights, just like how the Don't Say LGBTQ law came on the heels of the Parents' Bill of Rights. That was like parents have the fundamental right to direct the education and upbringing of their children. You do, right? That hasn't changed. That's in the federal Constitution. And so that also includes the parents of LGBTQ kids who love their children, who support their children. It is not only the bigoted parents who don't want their kids to learn that we exist as LGBTQ people who have rights when it comes to education. So again, read the purpose and policy. And again, it specifically says within the executive order, my administration will enforce the law to ensure that recipients of federal funds providing K through 12 education comply with all applicable laws, including, you guys see right here, FERPA. Has anybody seen the FERPA letter that I write, that I give to parents to send to schools? If you haven't, go to our website, southernlegal.org, and go to LGBTQ education resources. And there's a letter where I use FERPA, which has not changed. That law has not been changed. And the Parents' Bill of Rights in Florida, because I like to use their own strategies against them, to say, hey, under these laws, I, as the parent of a trans student, am telling you as the school, you have to use their correct name and their correct pronouns, period, full stop. That letter is equally valid today as it was before this stupid executive order. So don't stop enforcing your rights as a parent. And as I said, FERPA has not been amended. Title IX, by its plain meaning, protects LGBTQ students. We know that decades of precedent make that clear. And then Florida's Parents' Bill of Rights is still in place and protects the parents of trans students to ensure that their kid has access to a learning environment that feels good and safe and comfortable for them. I've gotten a lot of questions about Title IX. Just a quick update while we're under this K through 12 order. Yes, the U.S. Department of Education rules that went into effect under the Biden administration were blocked, right? Those did not create new law. Those did not change Title IX. They were guidance that made clear that sex includes LGBTQ students. So the Title IX says you can't discriminate based on sex. And it made clear that that includes discriminating based on sexual orientation and gender identity, in the same way that the Supreme Court said that same language under Title VII, the employment law, protects people based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Just because this federal judge in Kentucky, shocking, struck down the Title IX rule and made it nationwide, saying that the Biden version of this rule doesn't apply, and therefore the 2020 version goes back into effect under Trump, which did not specifically include LGBTQ students, does not change anything. Congress writes laws, courts interpret those laws. Courts have interpreted sex to mean discrimination based on failure to conform with gender stereotypes, discrimination based on sex stereotypes, etc. So keep using Title IX as a protection for LGBTQ students. Okay. Next executive order is keeping men out of, I said I wasn't going to read the titles. The trans sports ban, basically prohibiting just trans girls and women. They're just like with Florida. Remember our trans sports ban, no mention of trans boys and men, totally unconcerned about them, but prohibiting trans girls and women from participating in sports in accordance with their gender identity. Again, adopts those same inaccurate definitions of sex, tries to weaponize Title IX to penalize schools that allow trans girls and women to participate in accordance with their gender identity, seeks to or threatens to rescind federal funds from education programs that allow trans girls to compete, directs these different people to convene the major athletic associations to change their policies. What's interesting, and what we in Florida should be like, red flag, it requires the attorney generals in these states to educate them about stories of women and girls who have been harmed by male participation in women's sports. Anybody come to any of the Board of Medicine meetings or Medicaid ban meetings where the same 10 detransitioners whose stories they collected and cultivated and developed a script were brought before every legislature that was seeking to ban gender-affirming care pretty much in the country to tell their same story that was totally authentic and had no assistance from. And point is, they're doing that again, but to try to get people who have been harmed somehow by trans girls and women competing in women's sports, which they found that this impacted 10 people in our whole country. Thank God that is a priority of this administration. All right, anyway, the point of this is Florida is the playbook. If you want to know what they're doing next, look at what Florida did. Okay. Directs the Secretary of State and the representative of the United Nations to rescind support for and participation in sports programs or events that don't exclude trans women. I'm going to let you guys know, when the United States is no longer involved in any competitions, international competitions like the Olympics, people are going to be pretty upset. I don't think that's what they think they're signing up for. Directs the Secretary of Homeland Security to issue guidance under the Immigration and Nationality Act to deny trans women admission to the U.S. if they're seeking to participate in women's sports. And then directs the Secretary of State to ensure the International Olympic Committee amends the rules, trying to bully the rest of the world that participates in the Olympics into complying with our ridiculous rule that we don't like trans people. So again, what's going to happen is the U.S. will not be a part of the Olympics anymore, I think. Okay, so what is the status of the legal challenges to these executive orders? Because that was a lot of bad news. It's a lot of really scary, really harmful language. But the good news is there are still, at least as of right now, some systems of checks and balances in place. This is the tracker I recommend. When I send this to Jennifer, I'll make sure that there's hyperlinks to all the resources that I recommend, but there's a great tracker that it's crazy how often it's updated because there's just so many lawsuits against these executive orders, but that's the one I recommend. This is just a visual from the Washington Post of like sort of tracking, blocked, partially blocked, awaiting decision, upheld. All right, so let's just get into this real quick. The first one, the defending women from gender ideology extremism, the legal erasure bill, multiple provisions of this have been temporarily blocked by federal courts. One was the requirement to restore all the web pages and databases and resources about medical care that were removed, like information on access to reproductive health care and abortion and gender affirming care, et cetera. And the removal of anything that referenced sex instead of gender or anything that included promoting gender ideology. And then the provision that banned federal funding to promote gender ideology, which is super broad. Like that's just such a ridiculously broad statement. That was blocked and they said you can't prohibit federal funding on the condition of people not providing gender affirming care or not promoting gender ideology. The one about gender affirming care for minors, and by minor, I shouldn't say minors, I should say minors and some adults, people. This was temporarily blocked by 2 federal courts. Again, affirming the statement that I had put out originally about the ridiculousness of the provision on the female genital mutilation to try to scare people into thinking they would be prosecuted for their child getting care or for a doctor providing care. A federal judge said that this trespasses the president's power and that is entirely inapplicable, et cetera, that you can't expand the scope of criminalized conduct in one federal statute to another. Okay, and then the military ban, it has been challenged in federal court in multiple lawsuits. And during the preliminary injunction hearing, during one of those, the judge said, we are dealing with unadulterated animus. And anybody paying attention to our legal cases that are on appeal at the 11th Circuit know that what we need to survive these challenges here is we have to show that they were based on animus. So I love every time a judge throws in that language. And also said it was frankly ridiculous. Okay. Then the executive order banning trans women from, that is a weird, sorry, I don't know why they transitioned like that. Okay. The executive order banning trans women from women's prisons and banning gender affirming care for trans folks in custody has been challenged by 3 federal courts and blocked by all 3, or in 3 has been blocked by 3 federal courts. The executive order banning passport gender marker changes has been challenged and awaits an order. And then the executive order banning trans girls and women from sports has been challenged and is awaiting an order. Point of this is there are people that are working so hard to challenge all of these things as quickly as they come out. It takes a lot of time and effort and resources, but know that people are fighting, and none of us that are doing this work are giving up or laying down or feeling like it's hopeless. Absolutely not. Okay, this seems in the weeds, and I'm just going to give you like a super quick overview. The reason I think this is so important, and these are challenges to the federal funding, the federal funding freeze, which was a separate executive order. There's been a few of them, but basically, long story short, there have been multiple judges that have said that any of the orders that their enforcement mechanism is threatening to take away, rescind, block, whatever, freeze, terminate federal funding based on the president's priorities as shared through his executive orders are a complete, he is exceeding the scope of his authority, right? So an agency has no authority to act based on an executive order when it comes to funding. They have to have Congress confer the power upon them, and congressional appropriations, meaning the money that he's threatening to withhold from places that provide gender affirming care or support trans kids in schools or whatever it is, those are congressional appropriations that have to be done through Congress. That is how federal spending is done. Okay. So there have been these orders that have said federal agencies cannot do any of these things that are being threatened. After that happened, or after that order came out, where is it? Oh no. Okay, no, sorry. The U.S. Department of Justice, following these federal court orders, Trump's U.S. Department of Justice put out a notice that said federal agencies cannot pause, freeze, impede, block, cancel, or terminate any awards or obligations on the basis of the president's recently issued executive orders. That means not just the one that was challenged in that one case, but any of the executive orders that include federal funding, right? So then again, those same 15 attorney generals, who I'm a super huge fan of right now, when they put out that joint statement based on these orders from these judges, they said federal funding to institutions that provide gender affirming care continues to be available, irrespective of President Trump's recent executive order. If the federal administration takes additional action to impede this critical funding, we will not hesitate to take further legal action. This is the kind of leadership we need in our country right now. You guys will not be surprised that Florida was not among the 15 states, but nevertheless. Okay, so this is the statement. You should all read it. It's fantastic. Okay, so again, why does this matter? Let's remember how many of the executive orders that I talked about today, the only enforcement mechanism for the most part is withholding federal funding. So the gender affirming care ban, boom. The K through 12 anti-trans executive order, funding. The gender ideology executive order, funding. The trans sports ban executive order, funding. If that enforcement mechanism is not valid, then people should not be bending over. They should not be stopping affirming trans people, providing gender affirming care, supporting trans kids in schools, treating people in accordance with their gender identity in jail, whatever it is. They should not be doing that because the enforcement mechanism is not valid. Okay. I already said this, but just reminding you that we've already done all of this in Florida, right? Including paving the way for like banning gender marker changes on state issued identification documents. Many states never updated their policies to allow gender marker changes, but we in 2018 threatened to sue the Department of Health and got them to change the birth certificate policy to allow people to update their gender markers on their birth certificates. The FLHSMV had done that, had already updated it. So there's many states that had never changed it, but not a ton of states that had allowed gender marker changes and then undone that, like what Florida did and what the federal government is doing with Social Security and passports. So we are ground zero for so much of this, and we have lived through this, and our community is so resilient and so capable of hopefully helping folks elsewhere who are like, I can't believe this is happening, to understand how it happened here, what we did to resist and to push back, and how we've continued to survive in the face of all of this. And as a reminder, when it comes to the things passed in Florida, we have been largely successful in blocking all of them, and I won't say all of them, but most of them in federal court. Yes, we are on appeal at the 11th Circuit in many of these cases, and defending our wins at the trial court level. And I can't make any guarantees as to what the 11th Circuit will do. But the point is, we have successfully challenged so many of these same measures that they're trying to implement at the federal level. Okay, so I'm going to address access to legal authenticity real quick, because it's number one, an issue that so many people have questions about every day, that my inbox is flooded. And number two, an issue that is really important to and relevant to, protecting your trans kid in school and making sure they're being treated in accordance with their gender identity. So to be clear, nothing has changed access to name change, right? Let's be real. It's because cisgender people need name changes every day. It's not because they're like, that's sacred and we won't touch that. But the reality is anybody can still change their name at any time. If you need assistance with that, I do lots of name change clinics and also created a website called floridanamechange.org. But the point is, name change has not been impacted, and anybody that tells you it has is wrong. Okay, and then gender marker changes. So let's talk Florida for a second, because there's still a lot of confusion about this. So the FLHSMV stopped amending gender markers on Florida licenses, permits, and IDs in January of 2024. And they did not engage in rulemaking. There was no legislation that changed this. There was no bill, no law that passed. They just decided to do this, right? Then birth certificates, the Florida Department of Health similarly stopped amending gender markers on Florida birth certificates without any legislation, without any rulemaking, without any notice to the public. We are suing them over that. So driver's licenses, what actually happened? I have a memo explaining the whole thing. If you want it, you can click here when you get this. But basically through a random memo from the head of the FLHSMV, he just like redefined sex for our whole state when it comes to driver's licenses. That definition appears nowhere in the governing statutes. But basically what it says, if you actually look at the technical advisory, which is the only thing that has any weight whatsoever, is that a person's gender must be taken from their primary identification document. Previously, I touted that, well, guess what? A passport is a primary identification document. So therefore, this is a good thing because anybody can update their gender marker on their passport. But then Trump put that to bed. So basically what you need to know are a few things. Number one, this policy is only applied to people amending their driver's license, permit, or ID, meaning they already have one and it says the wrong gender marker and they want to change it to say the correct gender marker, which requires a replacement license, right? So if you're getting a first-time ID, your kid is 14, 15, 16, however old, they've never had a Florida ID or driver's license, they can get it issued in the correct gender marker if they have any other document, passport, birth certificate, etc., that says the correct gender marker, which I helped hundreds, maybe thousands of people change those documents prior to January 20th, 2024. Or yeah. This should not apply to anybody renewing their license. So if you already amended your gender marker on your license or ID prior to the new rules, you are not going to have it changed or revoked or anything like that. It's only people that are seeking to amend their license. And I already said this doesn't apply to first time. My advice used to be amend your passport first, but we can't do that anymore. Okay, just a cautionary word real quick. There was one DMV, or at least one DMV, that was changing people's gender markers based on their passport. It was great. They were ignoring this ridiculous new rule. And then someone did a TikTok video of themselves after she amended her license, which I totally get being super excited about it, but it went viral and it led to the FLHSMV sending her a letter being like, thank you for alerting us to this. And they closed that loophole for everyone. So in these times, we have to be super careful when we find something that works for us, that we don't inadvertently do something that slams the door for everyone coming behind us. Never ill-intended, but just it is something that can happen, and the state is looking for ways to hurt trans people right now. Okay, they doubled down on and reaffirmed in 2025 that this is only for replacement licenses, not renewals, and not first-time licenses. Again, you can look at this later. I'm going to send this around. Birth certificates. So they are saying that if you meet these very specific criteria, that you can amend your birth certificate. I'm going to let y'all know I have hundreds of clients that have tried, many of whom have had the exact evidence they say is required. It is a blanket ban on changing your birth certificate right now. I'm working with the ACLU of Florida. They're incredible. I know some of my colleagues are on here tonight, and we are going to challenge this. And the hope is that we can restore decency at least a little bit in this garbage state and make it so that people can amend their gender markers on their birth certificates again. So stay tuned. But please still, go through the name change process. It is better to have at least the right name, even if you can't have the right gender marker on your documents. You can definitely change the name on your birth certificate, driver's license, social passport, all of the things. If you happen to have an amended passport that does reflect your gender identity that you amended prior to the ban on passports, use that as your primary identification document instead of your birth certificate, including at school. Use the passport to change your kids' enrollment records and official records if you don't have a birth certificate that says the correct gender marker. Okay, federal documents, real quick. I'm just going to let you know they are not changing gender markers. They are not doing it. So if you if you have a document, if you have a passport that happens to say the right gender marker, right? And let's say it doesn't say the right name, do not send it in to change the name right now. They will revert it back to your sex assigned at birth. They're considering it a renewal. If you don't have a passport right now, like you sent it in to be amended prior to January 20th or after whatever, and they still have it, I want you to not be sad and devastated when you get it back. It probably will have your sex assigned at birth. I have many clients that have gotten theirs back. It says their sex assigned at birth. However, if you have a passport in hand that you amended previously before this administration put this stupid executive order in place, there is no reason to believe that it will be invalidated, that it is not usable, that it will be changed, etc. But upon renewal, they will likely change it back to your sex assigned at birth. The White House has made this clear through multiple statements. So I am recommending that you not, and here's the thing, to get a new passport, to change anything, you have to send it in. I want every trans person in this country to have a passport that will allow them to flee the country should that be necessary, not in a fear-mongering way, but in a just valid, like, I want you to be able to leave if you need to leave way. So even if it has the wrong information on it, do not send it in until we have more information, at least, about how they're going to be applying this new law, or this new, sorry, it's not a law, this new executive order. For Social Security, an internal message went out to Social Security employees that basically said not to make changes on their Social Security records. There is no reason to think they will revert anybody's records if they were changed prior to January 20th. If you had already changed the gender marker, there's no reason to think they'll change it back to your sex assigned at birth. The email that went out specifically said if the applicant requests a replacement card with no changes, follow the normal processing instructions. And if the applicant requests a replacement card with changes to fields other than the sex field, meaning name field, follow the normal processing instructions. So there's no reason to think they're going to change gender markers back on either of these documents. But for passports upon renewal, they likely will. Okay. This is just more information about the same things. They're not doing X markers anymore. I think I said that. Just real quick, I know there's a lot of accounts online, and I don't mean accounts, I mean like instances, stories online of passports being confiscated, being destroyed, people being detained. And I'm not minimizing experiences of anybody that is saying they've experienced this. What I'm saying is, to the best information that we have right now, we have not verified any accounts of that happening. That people are getting their passports back. They are able to travel. It's just that it will, if you had not amended it previously, it will say your sex assigned at birth. But there's a lot of these things that are circulating as being concerns have not been shown to be accurate. Okay, there is rulemaking going on for 3 different provisions relating to passports, and I'm going to send this to Jennifer, so I'm not going to go through it a lot, but make sure to submit a public comment. You have till March 17th to submit a comment about the DS-11. You have till March 20th to submit a comment about the DS-82, which is the renewal form. And then you have till March 20th to submit a comment about the DS-5504. Point is, all of them are the same thing. It's 3 different rules that would say you can't change your gender marker on your passport. And we need to make very clear to them why this is super harmful. If you need to check the status of your passport application because you submitted it and you have not gotten it back yet, you go to passportstatus.state.gov and type in some information, and it will explain to you how to find the status of it. I will say every trans client I have who has trusted me with the information to check this for them, they all say in process now, whereas before it said no information available. And I've had about 30 clients get their passports back in the last 2 weeks. So fingers crossed, but reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns. All right. Okay, and then real quick resources. So Florida Name Change for legal name change, that's the website that we created to help folks with this process. It's like TurboTax for name change. If you need to access care out of state, because of course SB 254 and the Board of Medicine rules and the things in Florida are still in place until we hopefully win our appeal at the 11th Circuit. QueerMed is incredible. You can access care out of state regardless of whether your child had started care, regardless of whether you're an adult who saw an APR or NP and needs to reestablish care, etc. If you need funding to get out of state to get care, The Campaign for Southern Equality has grants that you can use to get out of state to get care or to pay out of pocket to get care in Florida. You go to emergency grants for impacted families. Feel free to put my name where it asks, how did you hear about us? They're wonderful. Queer Trans Project has gender affirming flights where you can apply to have a flight covered to get out of state to get care elsewhere. If you need additional resources for funding for medical transition, social transition, legal transition, the Transit in the South guide from the Campaign for Southern Equality is incredible. It has lots of different resources, lots of different organizations you can apply to based on your specific circumstances, and it's a great resource. Again, because Title IX has not been, the impact of it, the application of it has not been changed. FERPA has not been changed. A lot of these protections have not been altered by these executive orders. A lot of the resources on our website are still totally valid and usable, including right here, the sample FERPA and parents' rights letter for parents of trans youth needing their kids to have their affirmed name and pronouns recognized at school. There's lots of documents like Know Your Rights for LGBTQ families that you can access. Okay, I know I did not leave a lot of time, but do folks have questions that I have not answered? Feel free to come off mute or you can type it in the chat.
I mean, I think that was so incredible. And I know you didn't leave a lot of time for Q&A. I was looking at the chat. Oh, here we've got one in there now. And just folks know that if you still have questions and we don't get to them, you can send them to me. And I promise I will make sure that Simone gets them, that we get them answered.
So great question about if your birth, so they have not thought this through very well, right? So if when you got a passport for the first time or Social Security is from birth. If you got a passport for the first time or a driver's license for the first time, using a birth certificate as your document to show who you are, and that birth certificate was already amended to show the correct gender marker and or the correct name.
Yeah.
How do they know you're trans? Excellent question. I can't wait to see them try to figure that out. But my assumption is if the only documents they have on file about you show the correct gender marker, there's no way that they could like reverse it. And I think they're going to have enough work on their hands with the ridiculousness of these policies they've created. So to be continued, but I have a feeling those folks are in the clear. Hey,
Can I ask a question? Sorry.
Sorry, so quick, really quick. Angelica in the chat, you just completed a name change? Should you move forward with getting new passport? No, absolutely not. Well, here's the thing. If the passport you or your child has now says the right gender marker, do nothing. Do nothing until I send out guidance saying otherwise. If it doesn't say the right gender marker, then go ahead and change the name. There's no harm, no foul, because there's no gender marker to change back. Same with state IDs, Social Security. If it doesn't already say the right gender marker, then go ahead and change the name. If it says the right gender marker, hold tight, reach out to me, we'll figure it out. Yes, India, you had a question?
I do. I have my partner is also trans and he's a combat medic from Afghanistan and gets his care through the VA. We both tried to change our passport gender markers before the Trump administration took over and they were delayed and we went through all that and they came back with the gender markers that we don't want. Mine has my male legal name, even though I transitioned in '89. I just never got around to changing it because it didn't matter to me until now. So then I got my name changed afterwards, which I couldn't get it done sooner. So I have a Florida driver's license in my male name. I have a court order in my female name change. I have a passport with my male name and my male gender marker. And I'm not sure how to go about what. I also purchased a handgun for the first time and got a conceal and carry license because someone tried to get in my house. And I can't pick that up because I have to do another background check with my new name now. And so it's just hard to navigate what I should try to do. And I'm also just curious if you have any inkling on transgender, care for adults through the VA. They've always been amazing to us up in St. Petersburg, but I don't know what to expect.
Yes, so for the first piece, any document that already has the wrong gender marker that has an M on it, absolutely go ahead and change your name. There's absolutely no harm to doing so. If you have any
Including, but my passport I'd have to send in to get the name changed to
right.
India.
So I'm not concerned about people sending in their passports to get name changes unless they've already gotten the correct gender marker, because
There.
they're not, what we've learned in the last just couple of weeks is they're not withholding federal documents, they're not destroying them, they're not confiscating them, they're just refusing to amend gender markers, which is horrifying. But
Right.
it means that you're going to have no trouble getting your name changed. They don't know the difference between a name change based on marriage or divorce or a name change because you're trans. So definitely go ahead and change your name because your gender marker won't be reverted. Same with your driver's license. If you don't have the correct gender marker already, then absolutely go ahead and change your name. Because I'd rather you have documents that say at least the correct name if you can't have both. As for care for adults, there's nothing right now indicating that they're going to try to extend it beyond 19. And again, they can't ban the provision of care. They can only they can only try to ban federal funding for institutions that provide the care or federal funding for the provision of care. So like for the VA, they could say, we are not going to provide reimbursement for or funding for any veteran who is transgender who is receiving gender affirming care. But they can't say the VA is, I mean, I guess they could say the VA is not allowed to provide this care or they'll risk federal funding being withheld, but I have a hard time believing they would be so stupid because we know that we have so many incredible veterans who served this country who are transgender. But all I can speak to is what exists right now. And right now I mean, we don't think that is an issue right now.
Thank you. And
Okay.
thank you for all you do and P flag everybody on here. I mean, everyone's just amazing. It's a wake up call living in Florida the last 2 years. But we're ready.
I appreciate that. There's been a couple of questions about HRT, like stopping, not being able to access care. The thing is there's no ban on like interstate travel. So even if you can't get care in Florida, there are other states that are still providing care that don't have a state ban in addition to this executive order that is, looming. So regardless of age, I would definitely recommend QueerMed. If for any reason your provider in Florida or elsewhere stops providing care out of fear or out of state law or whatever it might be. Permanent resident from Canada. Do I risk being banned from returning if I go to Canada? I don't, not based on anything I can think of. Not based on like what's on your passport. I think the answer is no, but there are always, of course, unique circumstances that could change the answer. So message me or email me if you have questions. Also, I should have said this at the beginning, like nothing I'm saying is legal advice. I'm not anyone's attorney. I'm just giving advice, whatever. Okay, are there any legal challenges that parents need to be aware of? Oops. In accessing gender affirming care out of state for a minor? No, they want you to think that the parent can get in trouble. Like SB 254 had that custody provision that made folks think that you could get in trouble for getting your kid care. Absolutely not. That's not the case. There is so SB 254 and the Board of Medicine rules, all of the liability is on the provider. And that sucks for our providers, right? It sucks for the doctors that have spent their life, providing gender affirming care and are experts in this. But for parents,
You ready,
there's
Shel?
liability for even if you were to get care in the state of Florida, which is a violation of the law. Like,
What are you doing?
oh, if you are not on mute, please go on mute. The liability is all on the provider. There's no liability on the parent, period. Do I know about 1495? Jennifer, is that the one you asked me about earlier? Okay, what it looks to me like, and I have been so focused on keeping track of the federal stuff that I'm not super up to date on the state stuff, but what it looks like is the Stop Woke and Employment Law 2.0, banning like being required to use a person's affirmed pronouns, being like banning required LGBTQ related or diversity related or, whatever cultural competency training for employers, but there could be more to it. I just have not been able to do a deep enough dive. So check back with me in a little bit. Any other questions that I haven't answered?
I think you're good. And I appreciate everyone staying on. Simone, as usual, like just incredible. I feel like it was a roller coaster of emotions. Listening to all the language and what's out there is just so scary, but the way you broke it down, and I know I feel better.